Prime Minister of Norway and is currently Executive Chair of the Oslo Center for Peace, Democracy and Human Rights, Mr. Kjell Magne Bondevik. I will please welcome him.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's really inspiring to see so many coming from the Nordic countries to unite in efforts for reconciliation and peace. This is what we need in the world of today, because we live in a turbulent world. We can think about the war going on in Yemen, where thousands of people have been killed and are killed today. We can think about the tragic war in Syria. We can think about the conflict which is still going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians. There is really a need for reconciliation and peace efforts. And I am convinced that a precondition for lasting peace is respect for human rights and for democracy. If people do not have influence on their own society, and if their rights are not respected, sooner or later there will be an uprising of good reasons. Unfortunately, sometimes also violent. So there is a very clear linkage between peace, human rights, and democracy. We know that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights from 1948 says, and I quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." For me, it's very interesting that the word dignity is mentioned before rights. Because in my view, human rights is a consequence of human dignity. And this is the basis of all our efforts for human rights and for democracy. Abuses on human rights and authoritarian and totalitarian regimes are encroachments of human dignity and will consequently, sooner or later, lead to uprising, revolt, and possible violent conflicts. And since we are gathered here today in this beautiful mosque of the Ahmadiyya community in Oslo, I will also point to the fact that Ahmadiyyas in several countries today are not only discriminated, but also prosecuted. And the last news that we have experienced show us that the situation has developed from bad to worse. And also we who are not Ahmadiyyas have to stand up for the right of and the freedom of religion. Yesterday I attended a seminar here in Oslo about freedom of religion and especially the right to convert, to change religion. And that is also rooted in the UN Convention on Civil Human Rights in Article 18. And I will repeat how important that is. Another point I will mention tonight with regard to our efforts for peace and reconciliation is a problem with so-called double standards. It may well be argued that the US and Europe, to some extent, have lost credibility as promoters of freedom and democracy. There are many examples. The plight of the Palestinians, the hesitation of Western governments to confront political allies with allegations of human rights violations, and military interventions, for instance, in Iraq, which, in my view, was in a contradiction to international law. To be consistent in promoting human rights and building confidence means no double standards. If we are criticizing human rights in one country, we have to apply the same standard in other countries. If we deny one more country, to enrichment of uranium, we have to do the same with others. If not, it's a double standard. This is true even if one is considered to be a friend and another to be an enemy. Hence, we are looking at another discontinuity which threatens to undermine the universality of human rights, the one that exists between what we do in one place and what we do in another. This is a challenge I have met several times when traveling, especially in the Muslim world, discussing what we can do together for peace, democracy, and human rights. And they point to that in the West, very often we have a double standard. You criticize us for abusing human rights, you don't criticize your friends. You are very eager that my country should not develop uranium and a nuclear weapon, but you're not criticizing your friends doing the same. I understand that. This doesn't work. Some words about democracy. Also because the Oslo Center, where I am the executive chair now, is working especially with democracy assistance projects around the world. Democracy is, in my view, a consequence of fundamental value, the fundamental value of human dignity. Every human being has a right to influence the society they are living in, locally and nationally. There is no clear and internationally recognized definition of democracy, but there are some main principles that must be implemented if we should define a regime to be more or less democratic. It must, of course, be free and fair elections. It must be a division of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial bodies. And it must be respect for the fundamental human rights as freedom of expression, assembly, religion, and law and order. Fortunately, if we compare the world of today with the situation about 30 years back, we have got many new, more or less democratic states. It's not only because of the fall of communism, but we have also got new democracies in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. What we are doing from the Oslo Center is to try to contribute to responsible leadership in fragile states and weak democracies. Responsible leadership is leadership by example, exercising a commitment to dialogue and to political cooperation and promoting human rights and democratic principles. Fragile states and weak democracies are to be understood as states that are vulnerable to internal conflict, that are characterized by political, ethnic, and religious divides, and weak state policies and institutions, and or states where democratic praxis has yet to gain a strong foothold. Good governance, both economic and political, is essential for legitimacy. It is essential for making citizens trust politicians and the political system as a whole. A country which is good governed is open towards debates and people, free from corruption, and give people progress in their lives. And it is essential that democracy is to share power and to respect the will of the people. Listen to the will of people means listening to all citizens, not only the ones that has elected us. I, very often when I'm traveling in other countries and discussing democracy, meet the misunderstanding that democracy is the same as the winners take it all. If one party, if one group win an election, they very often exclude all others and political minorities. But this is not about democracy. Democracy is also about how you treat the minorities, also the political minorities. It is about sharing power. And in many ways, therefore, it's a good thing that, as here in Norway, for instance, we have coalition governments. You have to share the power with other parties. And very often you have minority governments. And that is also, in a way, a positive thing. It's time-consuming, yes. It requires negotiations. I know very much about that. But it is democratic, because you have to take into consideration also the use of other political parties and groupings. It's not the winners take it all. It is sharing power. It is also, democracy is also about having a lively dialogue with the civil society. Because democracy is not only about political institutions. It's about people out in the society. And in Norway we have a very lively civil society, many non-governmental organizations working on different fields. And for me, when I was a politician, it was very important to go out and meet people in these frameworks and have a dialogue with them. Very often in other countries where I'm traveling, the political leaders are more or less isolated in their own offices, in their own residences, and they're not reaching out to people. So for us in the Oslo Center, it's important also to create frameworks and platforms for dialogue between politicians and the civil society. For instance, young people and women, who often still are discriminated. Inclusion of minorities, being political, ethnic, and religious, is crucial for every democracy. My last words, within my time limit, will be to point to the importance of using dialogue as a main means. I'm an ordained Lutheran pastor. It's a great honor to be in a mosque as a pastor. And we are both preaching. You are preaching, I am preaching, and that's fine. And we do it of good purposes. We want followers for our religion. Dialogue is another thing, and we can do both. Not at the same time, but we can do both. Dialogue is not about preaching. It's not a debate. I have been to thousands of debates. And then it's a question of winning or not losing. Dialogue is another thing. It's not preaching. It's not debating. It's more about listening. Listening to the other. Maybe they have a good point. Try to understand their situation. Maybe listen more than talking. I think that's why God created us with 2 ears and only 1 mouth. Then we can make an understanding, not necessarily agree on everything. Find out what we disagree on, but respect each other. Find out what we agree on. Very often we agree on much more than we expected. And use these common values to mobilize for reconciliation and peace. We have many shared interests. I have had very positive outcomes of also interreligious dialogue. I have learned much. I have learned also of being here at previous peace conferences. Now I understand this is the first Nordic one. And it's a great honor and pleasure to be here and to see all of you. And I wish you, from the bottom of my heart, a successful conference. Thank you.